Hey guys, welcome to part 3 of 3 in our video series on the global impact of the world wars. Today I'm going to be talking about the impact of World War II and the beginning of a number of very important post-war um, themes that we'll be looking at for the rest of the year. Here are the things that this video will cover. I'm not going to read them out loud to you just to save time, but you could pause and read them now if you want. So let's start with just a very basic overview of the course of the war. So trying to explain World War II on a single slide in like 1 minute is definitely inadequate. Uh, but hopefully you've read carefully in your textbook so you know this stuff. But real briefly, um, the war starts in 1939. Some would argue earlier if you look at Japan's invasion of China. But either way, in 1939, Germany invades Poland, and the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, expand at the expense of the Allies, who are currently led by Britain and France. France, in fact, gets totally taken over by Germany. In 1941, though, there's a major turning point in the war, which is that the United States and the Soviet Union join the Allies. The USSR joins because Germany decides to invade it, and the United States joins because Japan attacks it at Pearl Harbor. This is a major turning point. The USA and the USSR are two of the world's biggest industrial economies, and them coming in on the side of the Allies more or less seals the fate of Germany, Italy, and Japan. But it's still going to be a long and brutal struggle. From 1941 to 1943, the Soviet Union and Germany fight what is possibly the bloodiest and most brutal conflict ever in history, raging back and forth across Eastern Europe. Millions and millions of people died. 2 million people died just at the Battle of Stalingrad. The United States helps the Soviet Union fighting a minor front in North Africa and Italy, and also bombing Germany and supplying the USSR with like trucks and other basic military supplies. But the USSR does the majority of the fighting. The United States, at the same time, is also fighting a massive naval campaign against Japan and slowly pushing Japan back in the Pacific. The end of the war comes in 1945. In 1944, the United States invaded France, and Germany basically quickly crumbles after that. The United States then ends the war completely by firebombing and then nuking Japan into submission. In 1945, the war is over. The United States and the Soviet Union basically split Europe into two different spheres of influence, and the United States occupies Japan. With World War II over, we're looking at basically a completely new world now. Before the World Wars, Europe was the dominant power in the world. After World War II, this is clearly no longer the case. Germany and Britain, the two major powers of Europe before the World Wars, are completely exhausted. Germany is completely in ruins and is occupied by the victorious powers, and Britain's economy is more or less completely tanked, just in its effort to fight against Germany. So what is going to happen now that Europe is exhausted? Well, what happens is you see the emergence of two new major world powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has the world's largest standing army at this point, and the United States is terrified that the Soviet Union is going to just continue its invasion into Western Europe. The reason that we're afraid of this is because the Soviet Union is communist and is specifically anti-capitalist, which is what Western Europe and the United States are. So in order to discourage the Soviet Union from attacking and taking over Western Europe, the United States sets up NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is a defensive alliance that includes most of the major powers in Western Europe, plus also Turkey and Greece. You'll notice over here. And basically the idea is that if the Soviet Union attempts to attack any of these countries and expand its power into these countries, that the United States and all of these other countries will attack at once against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union responds in kind by setting up the Warsaw Pact, which is basically a mini NATO that includes the Soviet Union and these Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary and Romania and all of those guys. So now Western Europe is basically split into two military camps. They are also integrated into different economic blocs. The Soviet Union, which we'll talk about more later, forces the Warsaw Pact countries to go communist and to basically only trade with the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan, on the other hand, is what the United States does for Western Europe. The United States wants Western Europe to recover and become successful, capitalist, democratic nations. However, they recognize that in order to do that, they're going to need money to rebuild their economies. And so the United States basically just gives billions and billions of dollars to Western Europe to allow them to rebuild their economies and to recover and to resist communist advances. So the Marshall Plan and NATO together work to bring Western Europe into the United States sphere of influence and also allow for a rapid economic recovery in Western Europe. And so by the mid-1950s, Western Europe is more or less completely recovered from World War II, and their economy is continuing to grow. So anyway, to wrap all of that up, Europe goes from being the most powerful part of the world to basically being split between the two new emergent superpowers. But when we talk about two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, we have to recognize that the United States was, at this point in 1945, the definitive, most powerful country in the world, possibly the most powerful country ever. It was number one in the world by industrial production, producing almost 50% of all the world's industrial goods. This is partially because Germany's industrial capacity was completely destroyed in World War II. It also is the world's leading scientific and technological power, having just invented the atomic bomb and having huge amounts of money to invest in research and development. And to top it all off, the United States took basically no damage during World War II, whereas Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union and Japan were all devastated, completely devastated. The United States barely suffered any attacks. Whereas the Soviet Union lost over 7.6 million soldiers in World War II, the United States only lost about 460,000. So the difference is just totally vast. The United States is now in a position to really flex its muscles and exert its influence around the world. So what is the United States going to do with all of this power? It has a couple very clear goals. First of all, the United States views communism as a major threat to both capitalism and to democracy, the two kind of building foundational pillars of US ideology. So the United States is going to attempt to, quote unquote, contain communism, and that is to set up an anti-communist alliance of capitalist countries to prevent communism from spreading around the world. Also, in conjunction to this, the United States wants to be able to project its military power all around the world. That way it can fight against communism if it needs to, or fight any other wars that crop up. And last of all, it wants to protect international business. The United States economy relies on trade going around the world smoothly, and the United States wants to make sure that there are no more disruptions to world trade like there were during the Great Depression. So how is the United States going to do this? Well, basically, we are going to attempt to reshape global politics using a couple different types of organizations. First of all, we're going to use military alliances like NATO, but not just limited to NATO, to construct a multinational coalition against the Soviet Union and to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding militarily. We are also going to establish a network of hundreds and hundreds of military bases all around the world. These will include Air Force and naval facilities that allow the United States to deploy its military anywhere in the world that it needs to. You can see this map here. These are the major military bases that the United States controls as of 2015. So basically, the United States, even though we don't conquer very much territory during this time period, we do maintain the capacity to fight anywhere in the world that we need to. And last of all, we set up a number of new international organizations designed to ensure the free movement of goods and money around the world. Basically, we want to protect international trade. Let me fix that typo real quick. There we go. Yeah. So let's take a little bit closer look at some of these international organizations that the United States helps to back. First of all is the United Nations. The United Nations is not exclusively backed by the United States. It's pretty much backed by everybody, at least in theory. And the United Nations is a new worldwide organization that is supposed to include every single country in the world. And the idea is that countries will be able to bring their problems and their differences to the United Nations and to submit to the United Nations for some kind of peaceful resolution of the problem, or at least to make sure that the problem is understood by everybody involved. And so you can see here a picture of the UN General Assembly, and every nation is represented and gets to talk about and vote on various problems. The United Nations does not have an army, and it's not particularly powerful in the traditional sense, but it does have a lot of international influence. And the idea is to prevent any kind of miscommunication or confusion leading to another world war. Secondly, the United States also helps to support a number of new international organizations that create a totally new system of international trade laws. The most important of these is the World Bank, but also there is the International Monetary Fund and a new agreement known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that together basically work to connect all of the world's capitalist countries together into a single system of global trade. And the idea here is to keep tariffs between countries low. That way, capitalist countries can all trade with each other and specialize in making what they're best at. So, Germany can make BMWs, and Italy can make olive oil, and Honduras can grow bananas, and we can all trade with each other, and we'll all make lots of money. Of course, this has been criticized by some people as basically favoring the United States and rich countries over other countries, but it does result in expanding world trade hugely in the following decades. And last of all, and most innovatively, I would argue, is the development of the European Economic Community. This is an attempt by Europe to make future wars between European countries impossible by connecting their economies together. So France and Germany and Belgium and Britain all begin trading with each other and even integrating some of their basic governmental systems together to where they start to function more like a single country. And they'll eventually turn into the European Union, which they are today. And so this is successful in preventing any future conflicts between European countries because now they depend on each other for trade. And last of all, World War II basically signals the end for European colonial empires. One of the main reasons for this is that the major colonial powers of Britain, France, and Germany are completely exhausted after World War II. They simply do not have the will to fight. They don't have the manpower or the money to maintain these territories anymore. On top of this, there are a number of new challenges that basically make it impossible for them to maintain control of their territories. The first is the challenge of communism. Communism is specifically anti-imperial. And now that the Soviet Union has emerged as one of the world's major superpowers, they can actually fund anti-colonial struggles and anti-colonial military groups. And it just provides a rallying cry for poor working people around the world to fight against colonial oppression. One of the slogans of the Communist Party is workers of the world unite. And this applies to everybody regardless of race or where they live or anything like that. Second, a number of the main ideas that made imperial ideology seem okay in the 19th century are now completely discredited. The United States, fighting against Nazi Germany, positioned itself as a pro-liberty, anti-imperial power. And so it's really hard for us to finish beating the Nazis and then tell people in India and Africa that they just have to go back to listening to their racist colonial rulers. Also, in connection with this is before the World Wars, racism was more or less accepted by European powers as just simply true. But now racial ideology has been completely discredited because the Nazis made racism the basic building block for their whole system. So you can't really use racial justifications for colonial empires anymore. And on top of all of this, there's also spreading ideas of nationalism around the world. And so people in India and Africa are starting to say that Africa should be for Africans, India should be for Indians, Vietnam should be for the Vietnamese, etc. So this European idea of nationalism spreads around the world and basically undermines European empires, which is ironic. Now, does imperialism go away, or do we simply move into a new age of informal imperialism made possible by world trade? That's a good question, and we'll talk about it in some future video. So here's what we talked about. Hopefully this is all clear. I know I'm covering a lot of material very quickly. Feel free to email me or G chat me or whatever. Bye.